Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard. In this series we're looking at the book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of the games in that book one at a time and Reti's analysis of those games. Now we just looked at game number 51 by Capablanca. Now instead of game number 52, Reti offers a brief primer almost on Rook Endgames, of which Capablanca was a specialist. Reti says that Rook endgames in particular are some of the most common endgames, and the Rook is one of the best pieces to attack the pawn, because the Rook can be on the same file as the pawn and attack every single square that the pawn can move down. And because both the Rook and pawn move in a straight line, the Rook is often the best piece to try and guard a passed pawn and help escort it up the board in some way. Now, Reti also comments that as well as whether attacking or guarding the passed pawn, the Rook is generally best placed behind the passed pawn. So here, this Rook will be best placed on g1 behind the passed g pawn. And the reason for this is as the pawn moves up the board, if this Rook was on g1, as the pawn's moving up the board, the Rook would have more and more scope for action. Whereas now, if the pawn is moving up the board, then the Rook is going to have less action as the pawn moves up. It's going to have less squares it can try and control. Now, Reti does also comment that the Rook isn't as good at defending in general, and oftentimes other pieces such as bishops or knights can be slightly better at trying to block a passed pawn. And he uses this example wherein, especially if the Rook was, say, here or something, a bishop would be perhaps a little bit better in terms of blocking this passed pawn, because currently the king can just go to either side and then in front of the pawn if needed. You know, like king f4. If we try and check, we can then go to here. And we might be struggling a little bit because obviously checking, we can now just go to there and start trying to push the pawn. And just be quite careful, because if you keep on doing this, it's going to end up in a draw. I think this is a draw in this position. Whereas here it's a win. And because of that, Reti comments that a bishop is sometimes a little bit better at blocking a pawn or a knight, because it makes it a little bit harder for the white king to break free and to try and attack the piece and escort the pawn at the same time. Now, Reti also comments that as a general principle, in Rook endings, you need to try and attack rather than defend with the rooks. It's often justified to give up a pawn, sacrifice a pawn, in order to get your Rook into the opponent's position. Activity, especially with the rooks, is so much more important oftentimes than a pawn. And similarly, in a Rook ending, obviously your pieces always have to work together. And in a Rook ending, the pieces here is the Rook and the King. So the king must also act very aggressively to try and get into the opponent's position. And the king and the Rook acting aggressively together creates some cohesion between the pieces. It allows them to be more coordinated. Now, it offers a great example of this with this game. This is another game of Capablancas and Tartakower. Tartakower has the black pieces, and Capablanca has the white pieces. Now, Reti starts off this game by saying that Rook endings are very frequent, and that's why they are so essential in terms of becoming a very skilled chess player. However, Capablanca in particular had a very particular finesse when it came to them. Now, Reti comments that here, white has the advantage on the king side, 3 pawns versus 2, and black has the advantage on the queen side. we have 4 pawns versus 3. However, white is able to take the initiative on the king side, which is what Capablanca does. And that's what allows him to win. So Capablanca starts off with h5. So straight away, he's threatening to take, and win the pawn and also win the exchange. So black plays rook f6 to try and guard this pawn. Then after h takes g6, h takes g6, we see rook to h1. And white now has, well, white still has the advantage on the king side. This is white's stronger area. He had 3 pawns versus 2, now he's got 2 pawns versus 1. So Capablanca plays on this side of the board, he opens up the h file for his rook, and he immediately brings his rook over to the h file. He's not too concerned about the queen side at the moment. This is black's stronger point, but he's not too concerned about trying to defend that. He's far more concerned about trying to play more aggressively. Now black, however, makes a bit of a defensive move. He plays king to f8, because there's threats to try and come up to here, and the king being here perhaps enables king g7 to try and guard a bit better, or if need be, king to f7. Sorry, rook to f7. Now Capablanca immediately plays rook h7, seizing the 7th rank. We see rook to c6, defending this pawn. It's also counter-attacking this pawn, however it's not really a definite attack, because if black were to take here, then white can take here. And then white would have 2 clean pawns, both passed. So here, Capablanca plays g4, and Reti gives this move an exclamation mark. And he says that a lot of players would have to be quite anxious about black's play on the queen side, and they might make some more defensive moves to try and slow down black's play on the queen side. However, Capablanca decides against this. Capablanca goes for the most active play, and that's to try and push these pawns to get a passed pawn. He's not too concerned about black's queenside play at this moment in time. Now here we see knight to c4, and again we see g5. And with this move, Capablanca is giving black a chance to actually win the c-pawn. He's giving up the c-pawn. However, he's considered it quite deeply and is quite confident in the pawn he gets. So black plays knight to e3, check. We see king f1, knight to f5. And the point of this is that if black takes, white can no longer recapture on g6. However, Capablanca gives up this pawn, even with check. He takes on f5. We see g takes f5, and now king to g3. Capablanca is not too concerned about the material equality anymore. He's concerned about trying to support his passed pawn to become a queen. Black takes the pawn on c3. We have king h4, and now we have king f3 and g6, so giving up another pawn. Rook takes f4, king to g5, and now rook to e4. And now here, this is another finesse of Capablanca. He doesn't take on f5 straight away. So black probably wants to try and bring his rook back up to one of these squares to try and defend this passed pawn. Which is why he didn't take this d4 pawn, because then he couldn't bring his rook up. So he plays rook to e4. But here Capablanca plays king f6, another finesse of Capablanca's play. He doesn't take on f5. Instead, he plays king f6 to essentially prevent black from playing here or here, and also prevent black from checking the king, because black's own pawn is preventing black from attacking the white king. He's threatening mate, and its king is more active here. It's more aggressive. It's threatening the pawn going to g8 and then the rook to h8 and creating a queen. So here we see king to g8. Capablanca plays rook to g7. We have king h8 and now rook takes c7. We see rook to e8. King takes f5, and now white is already able to start like cleaning up the board. We see Capablanca has been able to he sacrificed a couple of pawns initially, but his position improved that much. He got such an active position that he was now able to start trying to clean up the board and take all of black's material. Here we see rook to e4, king f6, rook f4 check, king to e6, and now rook to g4. Capablanca plays g7 check, and now king g8. Now obviously exchanging rooks here would be lost because white can just take on d5, play king c6 and push the pawn. And black's king is just so far out of play, it is quite an elementary endgame to win. So we see g7 check, king g8, and now rook takes a7. You see rook to g1, and black hasn't really got anything to do, but there's no real way that black can try and get counterplay. So king takes d5, rook c1, king d6, rook c2, d5, rook c1. Then we see rook c7, rook a1, and now king c6. We have rook takes a4 and d6, and here black resigns. I went through the remaining moves quite quickly, but I think the main thing is that at this point here, white had equalized again materially. Except the difference is white have been able to sacrifice a couple of pawns to get a very aggressive, very active, very dangerous position. And that position allows white to now just mop up all of the remaining pawns on the board. Now, Reti comments that Capablanca's play, it appears quite natural, but when you're playing the game yourself, it can be very difficult to play in such a precise way. And Reti comments that the difficulty is mainly psychological, since you have to be willing to sacrifice some pawns, you have to be willing to be unmaterialistic. And it's sometimes very difficult to consider pawn sacrifices when material is already so limited. And to offer another example of this, he gives this position. So this is Lasker with white pieces and Spielmann with the black pieces. Unfortunately, the icons for the players are probably still showing Capablanca and Spielmann. Sorry, Capablanca and Tartakower. But hopefully you'll forgive me for that. Now, as I was saying, Reti talks about the psychological difficulty of giving up material. And he offers this game as almost an example of that. Now, in the game, we see h5. And he comments that all the commentators at the game thought that white was throwing away the victory here, and g5 would have been better. Now, g5 probably was better, but he certainly wasn't throwing away the victory. We saw g takes h5, g takes h5, and rook c1. And this rook c1 move was thought to be almost a losing move. Now, in reality, it probably isn't, but it was thought to be at the time. Because let's say white plays king f6 to try and defend, rook h1, king to g5, and it's going to be very difficult for white to be able to hold on to this pawn. Black's able to get quite a bit of activity. This is now a draw. So everyone thought that white had thrown away this position. However, instead, everyone thought that black threw it away with rook c1. and white throwing it away with g takes h5. What they were saying would have been better instead is rook to b4, h6, and then rook to b3. This was thought to be better, but it's still almost certainly a draw. Everyone thought that this was going to be a draw and white had thrown it away. However, what Reti comments was better here, which the commentators of the game didn't see at all, is king f4. This is the more accurate move, and this was made possible if we look at Capablanca's method of playing in the last game. Capablanca wasn't too concerned about sacrificing a pawn, he was concerned about getting his king to escort his passport up the board. And this is the more accurate ones, because after rook takes t4, king g5, white's able to quite easily protect this pawn and bring it all the way up to h8. This is very difficult for black to now defend. There's no easy way for them to do it. And this is the move which was missed by the commentators in the game. All the commentators were saying that Lasker had thrown away the game with this h5 move. But in reality, if he had played king f4 here, then he would have still won the game. Now, interestingly, after king b4, there is still a few other options. You could still take on e6, you could play king f6, you could play king d6. But king f4, I think, is the most thematic and the one which Reti really wants to demonstrate, because it demonstrates that you can sacrifice material. Your goal is to protect this pass pawn and get it to a8. That's your goal. Your goal isn't to win the other pawns. Your goal is to make a queen in the ending. And he says that it's this method of winning, it looks quite natural, but it's only the psychological nature of chess that led the commentators to have difficulty seeing it. They were being too materialistic, and that's quite understandable because there's not much material on the board. So of course they were going to struggle to see this. And that's what Reti's trying to get across in this chapter, the idea of activity and aggressiveness, especially in rook endgames. Activity with the rook and activity with the king. And that's what I think he demonstrated quite well. Now, in the next game, game number 52, we'll be looking at games by Bogulubov, who I'm quite looking forward to seeing some of his games for, actually. And so if you did like this video, please do like, comment, and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching.